I probably dozed, because I do not remember the arrival of the curate. I became aware of him as a seated figure in soot-smudged shirt-sleeves, and with his upturned, clean-shaven face staring at the sky. I sat up, and at the rustle of my motion he looked at me quickly. "Have you any water?" I asked abruptly. He shook his head. "You've been asking for water for the last hour," he said. For a moment we were silent, taking stock of one another. I dare say he found me a strange enough figure, scalded, naked save for my water-soaked trousers and socks, and my face and shoulders blackened from the smoke. His face was a fair weakness. His chin retreated, and his hair lay in crisp, almost flaxen curls on his low forehead. His eyes were rather large, pale blue, and blankly staring. He spoke abruptly, looking vacantly away from me. "What does it mean?" he said. "What do these things mean? Why are these things permitted? What sins have we committed?" The morning service was over. I was walking through the roads to clear my brain for the afternoon, and then fire, earthquake, death, as if it was Sodom and Gomorrah. All our work undone, all our work. He relapsed into silence, and then broke out again like one demented. "The smoke of her burning goeth up for ever and ever." His eyes flamed, and he pointed a lean finger in the direction of Weybridge. By this time I was beginning to take his measure. The tremendous tragedy in which he'd been involved, it was evident he was a fugitive from Weybridge, had driven him to the very verge of his reason. "What are we to do?" he cried suddenly. "Are these creatures everywhere? Has the earth been given over to them? This must be the beginning of the end, the great and terrible day of the Lord, when men shall call upon the mountains and the rocks to fall upon them and hide them from the face of him that sitteth upon the throne." I struggled to my feet, and standing over him laid my hand on his shoulder. "Be a man," I said. "You're scared out of your wits. What good is religion if it collapses at calamity? Think of what earthquakes and floods, wars and volcanoes have done before to men. Did you think God had exempted Weybridge? He's not an insurance agent." For a time he sat in blank silence. "But how can we escape?" he asked suddenly. "They are invulnerable. They are pitiless." "Neither the one nor perhaps the other," I answered. "And the mightier they are, the more sane and wary should we be. One of them was killed yonder not 3 hours ago." "Killed?" he said, staring about him. "How can God's ministers be killed?" "I saw it happen," I proceeded to tell him. "We have chanced to come in for the thick of it, that's all." "What is that flicker in the sky?" he asked abruptly. I told him it was a heliograph signaling that it was a sign of human help and effort in the sky. "We are in the midst of it," I said, "quiet as it is. That flicker in the sky tells of the gathering storm. Yonder are the Martians and London woods, where those hills rise about Richmond and Kingston, and the trees give cover. Earthworks are being thrown up, and guns are being laid. Presently the Martians will be coming this way again." And even as I spoke, he sprang to his feet and stopped me by a gesture. "Listen," he said. From beyond the low hills across the water came the dull resonance of distant guns and a remote, weird howling. Then everything was still. A cockchafer came droning over the hedge and past us. High in the west, the crescent moon hung faint and pale above the smoke of Weybridge and Shepperton and the hot, still splendor of the sunset. "We had better follow this path," I said. "Northward, toward London." While the curate had sat and talked so wildly to me under the hedge in the flat meadows near Halliford, the Martians had resumed the offensive. The majority of them remained busy with preparations in the Horsell pit until about 9 that night, but 3 came out about 8 o'clock, and advancing slowly and cautiously made their way through Byfleet and Purford towards Ripley and Weybridge, and so came in sight of the expectant batteries against the setting sun. These Martians did not advance in a body but in a line, each perhaps 1.5 miles from his nearest fellow. They communicated with each other by means of siren-like howls, running up and down the scale from one note to another. It was this howling and the firing of the guns at Ripley and St. George's Hill that we had heard at Halliford. The Ripley gunners were unseasoned artillery volunteers. They fired one wild, premature, ineffectual volley and bolted on horse and foot through the deserted village, and the Martian walked over their guns serenely without using his heat ray, and so came unexpectedly upon the guns in Painshill Park, which he destroyed. The St. George's Hill men, however, were better led and of better mettle. Hidden by a pine wood as they were, they seemed to have been quite unexpected by the Martian nearest to them. They laid their guns as deliberately as if they'd been on parade, and fired at about 1,000 yards range. The shells flashed all around the Martian, and they saw him advance a few paces, stagger, and go down. Everybody yelled together, and the guns were reloaded in frantic haste. The overthrown Martian set up a prolonged ululation, and immediately a second and third glittering giant answering him appeared over the trees to the south. The whole of the second volley flew wide of the Martian on the ground, and immediately his companions brought their heat rays to bear on the battery. The ammunition blew up, the pine trees all about the guns flashed into fire, and only one or two of the men who were already running over the crest of the hill escaped. The Martian who'd been overthrown crawled tediously out of his hood and apparently engaged in the repair of his machine. About 9 he'd finished, for his cowl was then seen above the trees again. It was a few minutes past 9 that night when these 3 Martians were joined by 4 others, each carrying a thick black tube. A similar tube was handed to each of the 3, and the 7 proceeded to distribute themselves at equal distances along a curved line between St. George's Hill, Weybridge, and the village of Send, southwest of Ripley. At the same time, 4 more, similarly armed with tubes, crossed the river and took up their positions in the huge crescent in absolute silence. It was a crescent with 12 miles between its horns. Facing that crescent everywhere, at Staines, Hounslow, Ditton, Esher, Ockham, behind hills and woods south of the river, and across the flat grass meadows to the north of it, the guns were waiting. The Martians had but to advance into the line of fire, and instantly those guns would explode into a thunderous fury of battle. Then, after what seemed an interminable time, the Martian nearest to the guns at Staines raised his tube and discharged it gunwise. There was no flash, no smoke, simply that loaded detonation. Then a second Martian raised his tube and fired, followed swiftly by a third and a fourth, until all the Martians in that vast crescent had discharged their tubes. The earthly artillery made no reply. Everything suddenly became still as the echoes of the concussion died away. Each of the Martians had discharged at some unknown signal by means of the gun-like tube he carried, a huge canister over whatever hill, copse, cluster of houses, or other possible cover for guns chanced to be in front of him. These canisters smashed on striking the ground. They did not explode, and incontinently discharged an enormous volume of a heavy, inky vapour, coiling and pouring upwards in a huge and ebony cumulus cloud, a gaseous hill that sank and spread itself slowly over the surrounding country. And the touch of that vapour, the inhaling of its pungent wisps, was death to all that breathed. It was heavy, this vapour, heavier than the densest smoke, so that after the first tumultuous uprush and outflow of its impact, it sank down through the air and poured over the ground in a manner rather liquid than gaseous, abandoning the hills and streaming into the valleys and ditches and watercourses. And where it came upon water, some chemical action occurred, and the surface would be instantly covered with a powdery scum that sank slowly and made way for more. The vapour itself did not diffuse as a true gas would do. It hung together in banks, flowing sluggishly down the slope of the land and driving reluctantly before the wind. And very slowly it combined with the mist and moisture of the air and sank to the earth in the form of a dust. Once the tumultuous upheaval of its dispersion was over, the black smoke hung so closely to the ground, even before its precipitation, that 50 feet up in the air, on the roofs and upper stories of high houses and even on great trees, there was a chance of escaping its poison altogether. And when it had served its purpose, the Martians cleared the air of it by wading into it and directing a jet of steam upon it. So setting about it as methodically as men might smoke out a wasp's nest, the Martians spread this strange, stifling vapour over the Londonward country. The horns of the crescent slowly spread apart until at last they formed a line from Hanwell to Malden. All night through their destructive tubes advanced. Never once after the Martian at St. George's Hill was brought down did they give the artillery a ghost of a chance against them. Wherever there was a possibility of guns being laid for them unseen, a fresh canister of the black vapour was discharged, and where the guns were openly displayed, the heat ray was brought to bear. Before dawn, the black vapour was pouring through the streets of Richmond, and the disintegrating organism of government was, with a last expiring effort, rousing the population of London to the necessity of flight. So you understand the roaring wave of fear that slept through the greatest city in the world just as Monday was dawning. The stream of flight rising swiftly to a torrent, lashing in a foaming tumult round the railway stations, banked up into a horrible struggle about the shipping on the Thames, and hurrying by every available channel northward and eastward. By 10 o'clock, the police organization, and by midday even the railway organizations, were losing coherency, losing shape and efficiency, guttering, softening, running at last into that swift liquefaction of the social body. All the railway lines north of the Thames and the southeastern people at Cannon Street had been warned by midnight on Sunday, and trains were being filled. People were fighting savagely for standing room in the carriages, even at 2 o'clock. By 3, people were being trampled and crushed, even in Bishopsgate Street. A couple of 100 yards or more from Liverpool Street Station, revolvers were fired, people were stabbed, and the policemen who'd been sent to direct the traffic, exhausted and infuriated, were breaking the heads of the people they'd been called out to protect. And as the day advanced and the engine drivers and stokers refused to return to London, the pressure of the flight drove the people in an ever-thickening multitude away from the stations and along the northward running roads. By midday, a Martian had been seen at Barnes, and a cloud of slowly sinking black vapour drove along the Thames and across the flats at Lambeth, cutting off all escape over the bridges in its sluggish advance. Another bank drove down over Ealing and surrounded a little island of survivors on Castle Hill, alive but unable to escape. Had the Martians aimed only at destruction, they might on Monday have annihilated the entire population of London as it spread itself slowly through the home counties. Not only along the road through Barnet, but also through Edgware and Waltham Abbey, and along the roads eastward to Southend and Shoeburyness, and south of the Thames to Deal and Broadstairs, poured the same frantic rout. If one could have hung that June morning in a balloon in the blazing blue above London, every northward and eastward road running out of the infinite tangle of streets would have seemed stippled black with streaming fugitives, each dot a human agony of terror and physical distress. Never before in the history of the world had such a mass of human beings moved and suffered together. The legendary hosts of Goths and Huns, the hugest armies Asia has ever seen, would have been but a drop in that current. And this was no disciplined march. It was a stampede gigantic and terrible, without order and without a goal. 6 million people unarmed and unprovisioned, driving headlong. Directly below him the balloonist would have seen the network of streets far and wide, houses, churches, squares, crescents, gardens, already derelict, spread out like a huge map. And in the south and west over Ealing, Richmond and Wimbledon it would have seemed as if some monstrous pen had flung ink upon the chart. Steadily, incessantly, each black splash grew and spread, shooting out ramifications this way and that, now banking itself against rising ground, now pouring swiftly over a crest into a new-found valley, exactly as a gout of ink would spread itself upon blotting paper. And beyond, over the blue hills that rise southward of the river, the glittering Martians went to and fro, calmly and methodically spreading their poison cloud over this patch of country and then over that. They do not seem to have aimed at extermination so much as at complete demoralization and the destruction of any organized opposition. They exploded any stores of powder they came upon, cut every telegraph, and wrecked the railways. They were hamstringing mankind. They seemed in no hurry to extend the field of their operations, and did not come beyond the central part of London all that day. It is possible that a very considerable number of people in London stuck to their houses through Monday morning. Certain it is that many died at home, suffocated by the black smoke. With the coming of the black smoke, the curate and I had taken refuge in a deserted house on some high ground outside Mortlake, and there we remained all day Monday, the day of the panic. My mind was occupied by anxiety for my wife. I imagined her at Leatherhead, terrified, in danger, mourning me already as a dead man. My only consolation was to believe that the Martians were moving towards London and away from her. I grew very weary with the curate's perpetual lamentations. I tired of the sight of his selfish despair and kept away from him as far as possible. In the pantry of the house in which we were imprisoned, we'd found a store of food, 2 loaves of bread in a pan, an uncooked steak, and the half of a ham. Bottled beer stood under a shelf, and there were 2 bags of haricot beans and some limp lettuces. The pantry opened into a kind of wash-up kitchen, and in this was firewood, and a cupboard in which we found nearly a dozen bottles of Burgundy, tin soups and salmon, and 2 tins of biscuits. I give this catalogue so precisely because, as it happened, we were destined to subsist upon this store for the next 12 days. It was on the Monday evening, at about 11 o'clock, that the event that was to keep us imprisoned in the house for over a week took place. We were sitting in the kitchen, eating bread and ham and drinking beer, when suddenly there was a blinding flash of vivid green light. Everything in the kitchen leapt out, clearly visible in the green and black, and then vanished again. And then followed such a concussion as I have never heard before or since. So close on the heels of this as to seem instantaneous came a thud behind me, a clash of glass, a crash and a rattle of falling masonry all about us, and incontinently the plaster of the ceiling came down upon us, smashing into a multitude of fragments upon our heads. I was knocked headlong across the floor against the oven handle and stunned. When I came to, we were in darkness, and my face was wet with blood from a cut forehead. For some time I could not recollect what had happened. Then things came to me slowly. A bruise on my temple asserted itself. "Are you better?" asked the curate in a whisper. "Don't move. The floor is covered with smashed crockery from the dresser. You can't possibly move without making a noise, and I fancy they are outside." We both sat quite silent, so that we could scarcely hear one another breathing. Everything seemed deadly still, though once something near us, some plaster or broken brickwork, slid down with a rumbling sound. Outside and very near us, an intermittent metallic rattling began to grow in intensity. "A Martian," whispered the curate. But the sound was not like that of the heat ray, and for a moment I thought that one of the great fighting machines had stumbled against the house, as I'd seen one stumble against the tower of Shepperton Church. Our situation was so strange and incomprehensible that for 3 or 4 hours, until the dawn came, we scarcely moved. And then the light filtered in, not through the window, which remained black, but through a triangular aperture between a beam and a heap of broken bricks in the wall behind us. The interior of the kitchen we now saw greyly for the first time. The window had been burst in by a mass of garden mould which flowed over the table at which we'd been sitting and lay about our feet. Outside, the soil was banked high against the house. The floor was littered with smashed hardware. The end of the kitchen towards the house was broken in, and since the daylight shone in there, it was evident that the greater part of the house had collapsed. As the dawn grew clearer, we saw through the gap in the wall a Martian standing sentinel over a still glowing cylinder. At the sight of that, we crawled as circumspectly as possible out of the twilight of the kitchen into the darkness of the scullery behind. Abruptly, the right interpretation of things dawned on me. "The 5th cylinder," I whispered. "The 5th shot from Mars has struck this house and buried us under the ruins." As we sat with our eyes fixed on the faint light of the kitchen door, there began outside a metallic hammering, and then a violent hooting, and then, after a quiet interval, a hissing, like the noise of a vast engine. These noises continued intermittently, and seemed, if anything, to increase in number as time wore on. Presently, a measured thudding began, accompanied by a vibration that made everything about us quiver on the vessels in the pantry ring and shift. Once the light was eclipsed, and the ghostly kitchen doorway became absolutely dark. The curate whispered, "God have mercy upon us," and sat quietly whimpering to himself. For a moment or so I waited, and then as the shadow passed from the kitchen doorway, I advanced, crouching and stepping with extreme care amidst the broken crockery that littered the floor. By raising myself cautiously across a fallen beam, I was able to peer through the gap in the wall into what had overnight been a quiet suburban roadway. Vast, indeed, was the change that I beheld. The 5th cylinder had fallen right into the midst of the house, directly across the road from the one in which we were hidden. The building had vanished, completely smashed, pulverized, and dispersed by the blow. The cylinder lay now far beneath the original foundations, deep in a hole already vastly larger than the pit I'd looked into at Horsell Common. The earth all round it had been splashed under that tremendous impact. Splashed is the only word, and lay in heaped piles that hid the masses of the adjacent houses. It had behaved exactly like mud under the violent blow of a hammer. Our house had collapsed backwards. The front portion, even on the ground floor, had been destroyed completely. By a chance, the kitchen and scullery had escaped and stood buried now under the soil and ruins, closed in by tons of earth on every side, save towards the cylinder. Over that aspect we hung now on the very verge of the great circular pit that the Martians were engaged in making. The cylinder was already opened in the centre of the pit, and on the farther edge, amidst the smashed and gravel-heaped shrubbery, one of the great fighting machines stood, deserted by its occupant, stiff and tall against the evening sky. And busy in the excavation was an extraordinary glittering mechanism, one of those complicated fabrics that have since been called handling machines. It was a sort of metallic spider with 5 agile legs and an extraordinary number of jointed levers, bars, and reaching and clutching tentacles about its body. Its motion was so swift, complex, and perfect that at first I did not see it as a machine in spite of its metallic glitter. The fighting machines were coordinated and animated to an extraordinary pitch, but nothing to compare with this. My interest shifted to the Martians themselves, busy in the pit. Already I'd had a transient impression of these, and the first nausea no longer obscured my observation. They were the most unearthly creatures it is possible to conceive. They were huge, round bodies, or rather heads, about 4 feet in diameter, each body having in front of it a face. This face had no nostrils. Indeed, the Martians do not seem to have had any sense of smell. But it had a pair of very large, dark-coloured eyes, and just beneath this a kind of fleshy beak. In the back of this head, or body, I scarcely know how to speak of it, was the single tight tympanic surface, since known to be anatomically an ear, though it must have been almost useless in our denser atmosphere. In a group round the mouth were 16 slender, almost whip-like tentacles arranged in 2 bunches of 8 each. Dissection has since shown that in addition to the great brain, the Martians possessed complex lungs and a heart, but this was the sum total of their internal organs. Strange as it may seem to a human being, all the complex apparatus of digestion which makes up the bulk of our bodies did not exist in the Martians. They were heads, merely heads. Entrails they had none. They did not eat, much less digest. Instead, they took the fresh living blood of other creatures and injected it into their own veins. I myself have seen this being done, and squeamish as I may seem, I cannot bring myself to describe what I could not endure even to continue watching. Suffice to say that blood obtained from a still living animal, in most cases a human being, was run directly into the recipient canal by means of a little pipette. The bare idea of this is no doubt horribly repulsive to us, but at the same time I think we should remember how repulsive our carnivorous habits would seem to an intelligent rabbit. Perhaps the most salient point in which the systems of the Martians differed from ours, however, was in what one might have thought a very trivial particular. Microorganisms, which cause so much disease and pain on Earth, have either never appeared upon Mars, or Martian sanitary science eliminated them years ago. 100 diseases, all the fevers and contagions of human life, consumption, cancers, tumours, and such morbidities, never enter the scheme of their life. As I watched the Martians lying in the sunset light, panting, stirring ineffectual tentacles and moving feebly after their vast journey across space, it seemed to me that the crab-like handling machine looked to be infinitely more alive than they. While I was still watching, the curate reminded me of his presence by pulling violently at my arm. I turned to a scowling face and silent, eloquent lips. He wanted the slit, which permitted only one of us to peep through at a time, and so I had to forego watching them for a time while he enjoyed that privilege. When I looked again, the busy handling machine had already put together several of the pieces of apparatus it had taken out of the cylinder into a shape having an unmistakable likeness to its own. And down on the left, a busy little digging mechanism had come into view. This digging machine was emitting jets of green vapour and working its way round the pit, excavating and embanking in a methodical and discriminating manner. This it was which had caused the regular beating noise and the rhythmic shocks that had kept our ruinous refuge quivering. It piped and whistled as it worked, and so far as I could see, the thing was without a directing Martian at all. The arrival of a second fighting machine drove us from our peephole into the scullery. for we feared that from his elevation the Martian might see down upon us behind our barrier. As time wore on, we began to feel less in danger of their eyes, for to an eye in the dazzle of the sunlight outside, our refuge must have seemed a blind of blackness. But at first the slightest suggestion of approach drove us into the scullery in heart-throbbing retreat. Yet, terrible as was the danger we incurred, the attraction of peeping became for both of us irresistible. And I recall now with a sort of wonder that in spite of the infinite danger in which we were, between starvation and a still more terrible death, we could yet struggle bitterly for that horrible privilege of sight. We would race across the kitchen in a grotesque pace between eagerness and the dread of making a noise, and strike one another and thrust and kick within a few inches of exposure. The curate and I had absolutely incompatible dispositions and habits of thought and action, and our danger and isolation only accentuated the incompatibility. His endless muttering monologues vitiated every effort I made to think out a line of action, and drove me at times, thus pent up and intensified, almost to the verge of craziness. He was as lacking in restraint as a silly woman. He would weep for hours together, and I would sit in the darkness unable to keep my mind off him by reason of his importunities. He ate more than I did, and it was in vain I pointed out that our only chance of life was to stop in the house until the Martians had done with their pit, that in that long patience a time might presently come when we should need food. He ate and drank impulsively in heavy meals at long intervals. He slept little. The curate had possession of the aperture when the first men were brought to the pit. He made a sudden movement backwards, and I, fearful that we were observed, crouched in a spasm of terror. He came sliding down the rubbish and crouched beside me in the darkness, inarticulate, gesticulating, and for a moment I shared his terror. After a little while my curiosity gave me courage, and I clambered up to the slit. At first I could see no reason for his terror. The twilight had come now, the stars were little and faint, but the pit was illuminated by a flickering green fire. The sprawling Martians were no longer to be seen. A fighting machine with its legs contracted, crumpled and abbreviated stood across the corner of the pit. And then, amidst the clangor of the machinery, came a drifting suspicion of human voices that I entertained at first only to dismiss. I crouched, watching the fighting machine closely. As the green flames lifted, I could see the oily gleam of the Martian inside and the brightness of his eyes. And suddenly I heard a yell, and saw a long tentacle reaching over the shoulder of the machine to a little cage that hunched upon its back. Then something struggling violently was lifted high against the sky, a black enigma against the starlight, and as this black object came down again, I saw by the green brightness that it was a man. For an instant he was clearly visible. He was a stout, ruddy, middle-aged man, well-dressed. 3 days before he must have been walking the world a man of considerable consequence. I could see his staring eyes and gleams of light on his studs and watch chain. He vanished behind the mound, and for a moment there was silence. And then began a shrieking and a sustained and cheerful hooting from the Martian. I slid down the rubbish, struggled to my feet, clapped my hands over my ears, and bolted into the scullery. That night, as we lurked in the scullery, balanced between our horror and the horrible fascination this peeping had, although I felt an urgent need of action, I tried in vain to conceive any plan of escape. But afterwards, during the second day, I was able to consider our position with great clearness. The curate, I found, was quite incapable of discussion. Strange terrors had robbed him of reason or forethought. It grew upon my mind, once I could face the facts, that terrible as our position was, there was as yet no justification for absolute despair. Our chief chance lay in the possibility of the Martians making the pit nothing more than a temporary encampment. I also weighed very carefully the possibility of our digging our way out in a direction away from the pit, and I actually spent the better part of that day in the scullery, digging with a hatchet as silently as possible. But when I'd made a hole about a couple of feet deep, the loose earth collapsed noisily, and I did not dare continue. After that I abandoned altogether the idea of escaping by excavation. It was on the 6th day of our imprisonment that I peeped for the last time, and presently found myself alone. Instead of keeping close to me and trying to oust me from the slit, the curate had gone back into the scullery. I was struck by a sudden thought. I went back quickly and quietly into the scullery. In the darkness I heard the curate drinking. I snatched in the darkness and my fingers caught a bottle of Burgundy. For a few moments there was a tussle. The bottle struck the floor and broke. We stood panting, threatening one another. In the end I planted myself between him and the food, and told him of my determination to begin a discipline. I divided the food in the pantry into rations to last us 10 days. I would not let him eat any more that day. And so our widened incompatibility ended at last in open conflict. For 2 vast days we struggled in undertones and wrestling conflicts. There were times when I beat and kicked him madly, times when I cajoled and persuaded him, and once I tried to bribe him with the last bottle of Burgundy. But neither force nor kindness prevailed. He was indeed beyond reason. On the 8th day he began to talk aloud instead of whispering, and nothing I could do would moderate his speech. "It is just, O God," he would say over and over again. "It is just. On me and mine be the punishment laid. We have sinned, we have fallen short." Then he suddenly reverted to the matter of the food I withheld from him, praying, begging, weeping, at last threatening. He began to raise his voice. I prayed him not to, but he perceived a hold on me. He threatened he would shout and bring the Martians upon us. I defied him, although I felt no assurance that he might not do this thing. But that day, at any rate, he did not. He talked with his voice rising slowly through the greater part of the 8th and 9th days, threats, entreaties, mingled with a torrent of half-sane and always frothy repentance for his vacant sham of God's service. Then he slept a while and began again with renewed strength, so loudly that I must needs make him desist. "Be still," I implored. He rose to his knees, for he had been sitting in the darkness near the copper. "I have been still too long," he said in a tone that must have reached the pit, "and now I must bear witness. Woe unto this unfaithful city, woe to the inhabitants of this earth." "Shut up," I said, rising to my feet, and in a terror lest the Martians should hear us. "Nay, I must speak," he shouted at the top of his voice. "The word of the Lord is upon me." In 3 strides he was at the door of the kitchen. "I must bear witness. I must go. It has already been too long delayed." I put out my hand and felt the meat chopper hanging on the wall. In a flash I was after him. I was fierce with fear. Before he was halfway across the kitchen, I'd overtaken him. With one last touch of humanity, I turned the blade back and struck him with the butt. He went headlong forward and lay stretched on the ground. I stumbled over him and stood panting. He lay still. Abruptly I heard a noise without, the run and smash of slipping plaster, and the aperture in the wall was darkened. I looked up and saw the lower surface of a handling machine coming slowly across the hole. One of its gripping limbs curled amidst the debris. Another limb appeared, feeling its way over the fallen beams. I stood petrified, staring. Then I saw through a sort of glass plate the face and the large dark eyes of a Martian peering. And then a long metallic snake of tentacle came feeling slowly through the hole. I turned by an effort, stumbled over the curate and made for the scullery door. The tentacle was now some 2 yards or more into the room, and twisting and turning with queer, sudden movements this way and that, I forced myself across the scullery, opened the door of the coal cellar, and stood there in the darkness, staring back at the faintly lit doorway into the kitchen, and listening. Then I heard the sound of a heavy body. I knew only too well it was the wretched curate's, being dragged across the floor of the kitchen towards the aperture. I crept into the coal cellar, shut the door, and began to cover myself up as much as I could, and as noiselessly as possible in the darkness, among the firewood and coal. I had no idea if the Martian was aware of my presence, and every now and then I paused to hear if it had thrust its tentacle through the opening again. Some time passed, and then the faint metallic jingle returned. I heard it slowly feeling over the kitchen. Presently I heard it nearer, in the scullery, I judged, and I prayed that its length might be insufficient to reach the door of the coal cellar. An age of almost intolerable suspense intervened. Then I heard it fumbling at the latch. It had found the door. The Martian understood doors. It worried at the catch for a minute, perhaps, and then the door opened. In the darkness I could just see the thing, like an elephant trunk more than anything else, waving towards me, and touching and examining the walls, the ceiling, the wood, and the coals. Once even it touched the heel of my boot. I was on the verge of screaming. I bit my hand. Then I heard the slow, deliberate sound creeping away from me, out through the cellar door. I heard it go into the pantry, and the biscuit tins rattled and a bottle smashed. And then came silence that passed into an infinity of suspense. I lay the whole of the 10th day in the coal cellar, in the close darkness, bedded among coals and firewood, not daring even to crawl out for the drink which I craved. It was the 11th day before I could bring myself to venture out from my hiding place. My throat was so painful that, taking the chance of alarming the Martians, I attacked the creaking rainwater pump that stood by the sink and got a couple of glassfuls of blackened and tainted rainwater. I was greatly refreshed by this, and emboldened by the fact that no inquiring tentacle followed the noise of my pumping. I dozed and thought disjointedly of vague, impossible plans of escape. Whenever I slept, I dreamt of horrible phantasms, of the curate and of the manner of his death, or of sumptuous dinners. It was early on the 12th day that I heard a curious, familiar sequence of sounds in the kitchen, and listening, identified it as the snuffing and scratching of a dog. Going into the kitchen, I saw a dog's nose peering in through the aperture. At the scent of me, he barked shortly. I crept forward, saying, "Good dog," very softly, but he suddenly withdrew his head and disappeared. I listened. The pit outside was still. I heard a sound like the flutter of a bird's wings and a horse croaking, but that was all. Once or twice I heard a faint pitter-patter like the feet of the dog going hither and thither on the sand far below me. For a long while I lay close to the peephole, and at length, encouraged by the silence, I looked out. Except in the corner, where a multitude of crows hopped and fought over the skeletons of the dead which the Martians had consumed, there was not a living thing in the pit. All the machinery had gone. Slowly I thrust myself out through the aperture and stared about me. I could see in every direction save behind me to the north, and neither Martian nor sign of Martian was to be seen. The pit dropped sheerly from my feet, but a little way along the rubbish afforded a practicable slope to the summit of the ruins. I scrambled to the top of the mound and looked to the northward. No Martian was visible. When I'd last seen this part of Mortlake in the daylight, it had been a straggling street of comfortable white and red houses interspersed with abundant shady trees. Now I stood on a mound of smashed brickwork, clay, and gravel. The neighbouring houses had all been wrecked, but none had been burned. Their walls stood sometimes to the second story, with smashed windows and shattered doors. Below me was the great pit, with the crows struggling for its refuse. Far away I saw a gaunt cat slink crouchingly along a wall. But traces of men there were none. For some time I stood tottering on the mound, regardless of my safety. For at that moment I touched an emotion beyond the common range of men, yet one that the poor brutes we dominate know only too well. I felt as a rabbit might feel returning to his burrow, and suddenly confronted by the work of a dozen busy navvies digging the foundations of a house. I felt the first inkling of a thing that presently grew quite clear in my mind, that oppressed me for many days, a sense of dethronement, a persuasion that I was no longer a master, but an animal among the animals under the Martian heel. With us it would be as with them, to lurk and watch, to run and hide. The fear and empire of men had passed away. But as soon as this strangeness had been realized, it passed, and my dominant motive became the hunger of my long and dismal fast. I had no plans for going anywhere in particular, for I did not know where to go. My dominant thought was of food, and with that in mind I set off roughly in an easterly direction. It took me 2 days to reach central London, and in all that time I saw no human beings, and no sign of the Martians. I encountered a couple of hungry-looking dogs, but both hurried circuitously away from the advances I made them. About a mile down the road from the pit I found in a ruined greenhouse some young onions, a couple of gladioli bulbs, and a quantity of immature carrots, all of which I devoured ravenously. And in a garden outside Putney I discovered a quantity of potatoes sufficient to stay my hunger. From this garden one saw down upon Putney and the river. The aspect of the place in the dusk was singularly desolate. Blackened trees, desolate ruins, and over all silence. It filled me with indescribable terror to think how swiftly that desolating change had come. For a time I believed that mankind had been swept out of existence. I became convinced that I was alone, the last man alive, and that the extermination of mankind was, save for such stragglers as myself, already accomplished in this part of the world. The Martians, I thought, had gone on, and left the country desolated, seeking food elsewhere. Perhaps even now they were destroying Berlin or Paris. There was black dust along the roadway from Putney Bridge, and it grew thicker towards Fulham. The streets were horribly quiet. I got food, sour, hard, and mouldy, but quite eatable, in a baker's shop there. Some way towards Walham Green the streets became clear of the black powder, and I passed a white terrace of houses on fire. The noise of the burning was an absolute relief. Going in towards Brumpton, the streets were quiet again. Here I came once more upon the black powder in the streets, and also several dead bodies. I saw altogether about a dozen in the length of the Fulham Road. They had been dead many days, so that I hurried quickly past them. The black powder covered them over and softened their outlines. One or two had been disturbed by dogs. Where there was no black powder, it was curiously like Sunday in the city, with its closed shops, the houses locked up and the blinds drawn, the desertion and the stillness. In some places plunderers had been at work, but rarely at other than the provision and wine shops. A jeweller's window had been broken open in one place, but apparently the thief had been disturbed, and a number of gold chains and a watch were scattered on the pavement. Further on was a tattered woman in a heap on a doorstep. The hand that hung over her knee was gashed and bled down her rusty brown dress, and a smashed magnum of champagne formed a pool across the pavement. She seemed asleep, but she was dead. In South Kensington the streets were clear of dead and of black powder. It was near South Kensington that I first heard the howling. It crept almost imperceptibly upon my senses. It was a sobbing alternation of two notes, "Oola, oola, oola," keeping on perpetually. When I passed streets that ran northwards, it increased in volume, and houses and buildings seemed to deaden and cut it off again. It came to a full tide down Exhibition Road. I stopped, staring towards Kensington Gardens, wondering at this strange, remote wailing. It was as if that mighty desert of houses had found a voice for its fear and its solitude. "Oola, oola, oola," wailed that superhuman note, great waves of sound sweeping down the broad sunlit roadway between the tall buildings on either side. I turned northward, marvelling towards the iron gates of Hyde Park. All the large mansions on either side of the road were empty and still, and my footsteps echoed against the sides of the houses. I entered the park and approached as far as the bridge over the Serpentine. The howling grew stronger and stronger, that I could see nothing above the housetops on the north side of the park, save a haze of smoke to the northwest. I came into Oxford Street, by the Marble Arch, and here again was the black powder and several bodies, and an evil, ominous smell from the gratings of the cellars of some of the houses. I wandered on through the silent residential squares to Baker Street, and so came out at last upon Regent's Park. I came upon the wrecked handling machine just by one of the entrances to Regent's Park. At first I thought a house had fallen across the road. It was only as I clambered among the ruins that I saw with a start this mechanical Samson lying with its tentacles bent and smashed and twisted among the ruins it had made. The forepart was shattered. It seemed as if it had driven blindly straight at the house and been overwhelmed in its overthrow. As I pushed on into the park, I saw far away through a gap in the trees a second handling machine, motionless as the first. And then, abruptly, the howling ceased. It was, as it were, cut off. The silence came like a thunderclap. Night, the mother of fear and mystery, was coming upon me. While that strange howling had sounded, the solitude, the desolation, had been endurable. By virtue of it, London seemed strangely alive, and the sense of life about me had upheld me. Then, suddenly, a change, the passing of something, I knew not what, and then a stillness that could be felt. Nothing but this gaunt quiet. Terror seized me, and I turned and ran blindly back out of the park. I found myself in St. John's Wood Road, and I ran headlong from this unendurable stillness At last, breathless and exhausted, I found a cabman's shelter in the Harrow Road, and there I hid from the night and the silence. Just before dawn, my courage returned, and while the stars were still in the sky, I turned once more towards Regent's Park. I missed my way among the streets and presently saw down a long avenue, in the half-light of the early dawn, the curve of Primrose Hill. On the summit, towering up to the fading stars, was a third handling machine, erect and motionless like the others. An insane resolve possessed me. I would die and end it, and I would save myself even the trouble of killing myself. I marched on recklessly towards this Titan, and then, as I drew nearer and the light grew, I saw that a multitude of black birds were circling and clustering about the hood. At that my heart gave a bound, and I began running along the road. I hurried down St. Edmund's Terrace and emerged upon the grass before the rising of the sun. Great mounds had been heaped about the crest of the hill, making a huge redoubt of it. It was the final and largest place the Martians made, and from behind these heaps there rose a thin smoke against the sky. Against the skyline an eager dog ran and disappeared. The thought that had flashed into my mind grew real, grew credible. I felt no fear, only a wild, trembling exultation as I ran up the hill towards the motionless monster. Out of the hood hung lank shreds of brown, at which the hungry birds pecked and tore. In another moment I had scrambled up the earthen rampart and stood on its crest, and the interior of the redoubt was below me. A mighty space it was, with gigantic machines here and there within it, huge mounds of material and strange shelter places, and scattered about it, some in their overturned war machines, some in the now rigid handling machines, and a dozen of them stark and silent and laid in a row, were the Martians, all dead. Here and there they were scattered, nearly 50 altogether, in that great gulf they had made, overtaken by a death that must have seemed to them as incomprehensible as any death could be. To me also at that time this death was incomprehensible. All I knew was that these things that had been alive and so terrible to men were dead. I stood staring into the pit, and my heart lightened gloriously, even as the rising sun struck the world to fire about me with his rays. The pit was still in darkness. The mighty engines, so great and wonderful in their power and complexity, so unearthly in their tortuous forms, rose weird and vague and strange out of the shadows towards the light. Across the pit on its further lip, flat and vast and strange, lay the great flying machine with which they had been experimenting upon our denser atmosphere when decay and death arrested them. Death had not come a day too soon. At the sound of cawing overhead, I looked up at the huge fighting machine that would fight no more, at the tattered red shreds of flesh that dripped down upon the overturned seats on the summit of Primrose Hill. It had died even as it had been crying to its companions. Perhaps it was the last to die, and its voice had gone on perpetually until the force of its machinery was exhausted. It glittered now, harmless tripod towers of shining metal in the brightness of the rising sun. All about the pit, and saved as by a miracle from everlasting destruction, stretched the great mother of cities. Those who have only seen London veiled in her sombre robes of smoke can scarcely imagine the naked clearness and beauty of the silent wilderness of houses. Eastward, over the blackened ruins of the Albert Terrace and the splintered spire of the church, the sun blazed dazzling in a clear sky, and here and there some facet in the great wilderness of roofs caught the light and glared with a white intensity. Northward were Kilburn and Hampstead, blue and crowded with houses. Westward the great city was dimmed, and southward, beyond the Martians, the green waves of Regent's Park, the Langham Hotel, the dome of the Albert Hall, the Imperial Institute, and the giant mansions of the Brompton Road came out clear and little in the sunrise, the jagged ruins of Westminster rising hazily beyond. Far away and blue were the Surrey hills, and the towers of the Crystal Palace glittered like 2 silver rods. The dome of St. Paul's was dark against the sunrise, and injured, I saw for the first time, by a huge gaping cavity on its western side. And as I looked at this wide expanse of houses and factories and churches, silent and abandoned, as I thought of the multitudinous hopes and efforts, the innumerable hosts of lives that had gone to build this human reef, and of the swift and ruthless destruction that had hung over it all, when I realized that the shadow had been rolled back and that men might still live in the streets, and this dear, vast city of mine be once more alive and powerful, I felt a wave of emotion that was near akin to tears. Of the next 3 days I remember nothing. I have learned since that far from my being the first discoverer of the Martian overthrow, several such wanderers as myself had already discovered this on the previous night. One man, the first, had gone to St. Martin's-le-Grand, and while I sheltered in the cabman's hut had contrived to telegraph to Paris. Thence the joyful news had flashed all over the world. 1,000 cities, chilled by ghastly apprehensions, suddenly flashed into frantic illumination. They knew of it in Dublin, Edinburgh, Manchester, Birmingham, at the time when I stood upon the verge of the pit. Already men weeping with joy, as I have heard, shouting and staying their work to shake hands and shout, were making up trains to descend upon London. The church bells that had ceased a fortnight since suddenly caught the news, until all England was bell-ringing. Men on cycles, lean-faced, unkempt, scorched along every country lane, shouting of unhoped deliverance, shouting to gaunt, staring figures of despair. And the food, across the Channel, across the Irish Sea, across the Atlantic, corn, bread and meat were tearing to our relief. All the shipping in the world seemed going Londonward in those days. But of all this I have no memory. I drifted, a demented man. I found myself in the house of kindly people who had found me on the 3rd day, wandering, weeping and raving through the streets of St. John's Wood. Troubled as they were with their own affairs, they sheltered and fed me, and very gently, when my mind was assured again, they told me what they had learnt of the fate of Leatherhead. 2 days after I was imprisoned in the house at Mortlake, it had been destroyed, with every soul in it, by a Martian. He had swept it out of existence, as it seemed, without any provocation, as a boy might crush an anthill, in the mere wantonness of power. I cannot but regret, now that I am concluding my story, how little I am able to contribute to the discussion of the many debatable questions which are still unsettled. My particular province is speculative philosophy. My knowledge of comparative physiology is confined to a book or two, but it seems to me that Carver's suggestion as to the reason for the rapid death of the Martians is so probable as to be regarded almost as a proven conclusion. They were slain, it seems, by the putrefactive and disease bacteria against which their systems were unprepared. Slain, after all man's devices had failed, by the humblest things of all that God in his wisdom has put upon this earth. It had come about in a way that I and many men might indeed have foreseen, had not terror and disaster blinded our minds. These germs of disease have taken toll of humanity since the beginning of things, taken toll of our pre-human ancestors since life began here. But by virtue of this natural selection of our kind, we have developed resisting power. To no germs do we succumb without a struggle, and to many, those that cause putrefaction in dead matter, for instance, our living frames are altogether immune. But there are no bacteria on Mars, and directly those invaders arrived, directly they drank and fed, our microscopic allies began to work their overthrow. They were irrevocably doomed, even as they went to and fro, and the end was inevitable. By the toll of 1 billion deaths, man has bought his birthright of the earth, and it is his against all comers. It would still be his were the Martians 10 times as mighty as they are. In all the bodies of the Martians that were examined after the war, no bacteria, except those already known as terrestrial species, were found. That they did not bury any of their dead, and the reckless slaughter they perpetrated, point also to an entire ignorance of the putrefactive process. The generator of the heat ray remains a puzzle, and the composition of the black smoke which the Martians used with such deadly effect is not known. Spectrum analysis of the black powder points unmistakably to the presence of an unknown element with a brilliant group of 3 lines in the green, and it is possible that it combines with argon to form a compound which acts at once with deadly effect upon some constituent in the blood. But such speculations, both on the nature of the Martians themselves and on the materials and methods at their disposal, must remain unproven. Questions of much graver and universal interest occupy our minds today. Our views of the human future have been greatly modified by the terrible events I have described. We have learned now that we cannot regard this planet as being fenced in and a secure hiding place for man. And it may be that in the larger design of the universe, this invasion from Mars is not without its ultimate benefit for men. At least it has robbed us of that serene confidence in the future which is the most fruitful source of decadence. The gifts to human science it has brought are enormous, and it has done much to promote the conception of the common weal of mankind. The broadening of man's views that has resulted can scarcely be exaggerated. Before the cylinder fell, there was a general persuasion that through all the deep of space no life existed beyond the petty surface of our minute sphere. Now we see further. On clear nights I stand in my garden and gaze up and out across all those millions of miles to where the tiny red dot that is Mars winks and sparkles in the night sky. It may be that across the great immensities of space the Martians have watched the fate of those pioneers of theirs and learned their lesson, that they will turn their attention to other planets in the solar system and never again come near this little Earth of ours. It may be, on the other hand, that the destruction of the Martians is only a reprieve for us, that even now they are preparing, planning, waiting for the right moment to strike again.